Cupcakes for sale.
This week in a Manhattan mall, I held a bake sale, a racist bake sale.
We have different prices here. If you're Asian, $1.50. If you're white, $1. If you're Latino or black, 50 cents.
That's not right.
You got to be on your goddamn mind. Boy, close down.
Is the cupcake poison?
I didn't come up with this idea. I'd copied what some students had done. They call it an affirmative action bake sale.
Why does it have to be shut down?
Here at Bucknell University, the administrators shut the bake sale down. The Students' Conservative Club said they just wanted to start a conversation about affirmative action, which does make it harder for Asians to get admitted, but easier for blacks and Latinos. But before much conversation started, they were shut down. So I ran the bake sale so we could see what kind of discussion the Bucknell students missed.
I'm trying to make amends for racism and punish the Asians because they have an advantage. They have such high SAT scores.
No, that's not true. Because I had an Asian student in my class that was dumb as a cardboard.
That's stereotyping.
It is stereotyping.
That's not right.
Affirmative action is supposed to help minorities that have been discriminated against. But Latinos and blacks who saw my sign didn't like it.
That makes me feel bad because I'm both Latino and black.
Should I not do this because it might hurt people's feelings?
Not only it should hurt people's feelings, but it's just like out of sense of respect.
It's very hurtful, it's very demeaning.
And America has been a bastion of free speech. Oh, except for a few places like the liberal media, especially ABC News, where I used to work. No, actually, they were pretty good. They pretty much let me say most things. The real bastion of political correctness and rules against certain kinds of speech has become the American university. I think a university would be a safe haven for free speech. It's supposed to be. A justification for giving teachers tenure was to make sure they could freely express even unpopular ideas. But today, some universities try to ban unpopular ideas. Helping to fight that is a group called FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. They defend students whose speech is shut down by universities. The director of FIRE is Greg Lukianoff. He joins us now with two students whose schools told them, shut up. Kirby Thomas ran that affirmative action bake sale at Bucknell that we showed you being shut down earlier. Hayden Barnes criticized his school for building a parking garage. He said it was environmentally unfriendly. The administrators didn't like that, so they drove him out of school. Hayden, what do you mean they drove you out of school?
I was dismissed for disagreeing with the university president about the necessity of a parking deck.
I mean, that's all you did? You said, I disagree?
Well, I made alternatives known in a letter to the student newspaper, to the student government, and the faculty senate. I also posted a satirical cartoon on my Facebook page.
And for this, they called you a clear and present danger.
Yes, they did.
It's totally true.
Greg Lukianoff?
Hayden's case, I mean, before working at FIRE, I had no idea. You can get in trouble for the most incredible nonsense on college campuses, and I feel like our society is largely in denial about this. Hayden Barnes got kicked out of college for a collage he placed on Facebook criticizing a parking garage. I can't repeat that enough. And if you're already got that far gone, something seriously wrong has happened in the places that are supposed to encourage free speech, like really brave free speech.
And you brought a court case. Eventually, it takes forever, but then you had to graduate from another school.
I had to transfer, and I'm currently in law school, but it has been quite a struggle.
And a bad outcome if that's what put you in law school.
Some would say that.
Kirby, why did you want to run an affirmative action bake sale?
Our group thinks affirmative action is a really relevant topic, important to talk about, and we just wanted to get a discussion going on our campus.
But you oppose race-based affirmative action.
Absolutely.
And it is pretty provocative.
It is. It's hard to get people talking on a college campus, and when you do something controversial, and opposing affirmative action is kind of controversial anyway on a college campus, but
kind of.
I guess that's an understatement. But in that context, it really got people talking.
But the talk was stopped because within an hour you were shut down.
Yeah, the students who came wanted to talk about it. We had a great discussion going, even agreed on some points about like maybe socioeconomic affirmative action for underprivileged students economically. But the university came and they didn't want any of that going on.
Well, I ran my bake sale so I could hear some of the comments that I assume you would have heard had you been allowed to run yours, and the comments were interesting. At first, people called me racist.
What is funny to you about people who are less privileged?
But then some people defended me.
You're trying to make a point, right?
Right.
So yeah, sometimes you got to do things like that to make a point. It's not racist.
And people started to think about what affirmative action means.
No race of people is worth more than another, or less.
Well, do you believe in affirmative action in colleges?
I used to, but I really don't think that it helps.
By the end, most people said equality means no affirmative action.
Everybody should be treated equally. No matter what race you come from, everybody should get equal the same.
So I found that interesting. People went from belligerence to a real conversation, and I guess that's your point.
On every major issue that America faces today, I've seen students get in trouble for being on the wrong side of that argument. And you can't have a meaningful dialogue if people have to fear punishment for having an opposite opinion.
And these bake sales have been shut down not just at your school, but at UCLA, William and Mary, UC Irvine. Most schools these days do allow them. They've wised up.
Yeah, they started back in 2003, and the first 6 that that were held, universities found all these different excuses for shutting them down, basically coming down to the fact they didn't like the message. And there's been at least 3 dozen of these protests, and I think actually many, many more over the years. But Bucknell is just standing firm. That kind of like
well, Bucknell just last night sent me an email. State and federal laws prohibit discrimination.
Yeah.
The university believes in upholding the law. There's no just kidding clause in the laws. So price discrimination is discrimination.
Yeah, and I love this argument that Bucknell's standing by because it's clearly a symbolic protest. There's nobody denies that. And there are these things called gender gap bake sales across the country where women get charged less than men to protest the gap in pay between men and women.
So a feminist group complaining about the so-called pay gap does the same thing.
And they never get shut down.
Is it just conservatives who get shut up?
You know, definitely you are much more likely to get in trouble if you have a socially conservative point of view on campus. But in my experience, and FIRE has come to the defense of people all over the political spectrum. We've certainly had cases where we've had to come to the defense of PETA at a school in Florida where an administrator just said, I liked her honesty, that she actually came out and said, you can't table for PETA because I don't like that group.
But I would think most of the time they would say, we want to have a civilized discussion. We want our campus to be a kind place.
Right.
If students feel oppressed, they won't learn. That sounds reasonable.
It sounds very nice, but freedom of speech and academic freedom and meaningful discussion is a deadly serious business. And if you limit it only to what people are comfortable with, then you end up shutting any meaningful discourse up.
Today's affirmative action is racism in an effort to pave a well-planned roadmap for its future. Western Washington University recently decided to send out a simple, 6-question survey. From meeting off-campus needs, to discovering the role of liberal arts and sciences at UWA, the university sought to improve on the basis of these answers. 2 of the questions focused in on race. One read, how do we make sure that in future years we are not as black as we are today? Not as black as we are today? In other words, the insinuation is that the university's student body is comprised of far too many people of African American descent, and that in future years UWA must take steps to reduce this disproportionate ethnic majority. University of Michigan student Bree Benton, left, demonstrates outside the federal courthouse, Wednesday, March 7, 2012, in Cincinnati, where the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals was hearing oral arguments in their review of their ruling last summer that proposal to, the ban on affirmative action in Michigan, is unconstitutional. Credit, AP University of Michigan student Bree Benton, left, demonstrates outside the federal courthouse, Wednesday, March 7, 2012, in Cincinnati, where the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals was hearing oral arguments in their review of their ruling last summer that proposal to, The ban on affirmative action in Michigan is unconstitutional. Credit AP. This happened nearly 2 weeks ago, and yet, where was the national outrage? Where was the national outcry? It's hard to believe anyone would read such an atrocity and not loudly disagree. The lack of national outcry to this racist assertion is simple. Here's the actual question. How do we make sure that in future years we are not as white as we are today? This is affirmative action, in action. Affirmative action as practiced today doesn't, as Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor recently wrote, prevent so-called selective barriers against racial minorities from being erected. It erects barriers and prejudices against those whose accident of birth didn't make them a minority. This wasn't always the case. In fact, affirmative action was originally a good idea. It was meant to rectify ills that racial discrimination had perpetrated. Chiefly, as the Heritage Foundation notes, it authorized courts to take affirmative action to uproot racially discriminatory practices. That objective was, and remains, morally right. But that same statute forbade race preference. It is morally wrong. People wait outside the Supreme Court in anticipation of key decisions being announced, on Capitol Hill in Washington, Monday, June 17, 2013. With a week remaining in the current Supreme Court term, several major cases are still outstanding that could have widespread political impact on same-sex marriage, voting rights, and affirmative action. AP. The concept of affirmative action has since been shanghaied, rebranded and relaunched into something just as bad as the racial discrimination that brought the Civil Rights Act into fruition in the first place. Indeed, instead of simply eradicating the horrors of segregation and racial superiority, today's affirmative action has forced the concept of racial proportionality to such an extent that openly discriminating, like the UWA questionnaire, against non-minorities has become perfectly acceptable. Voters in the state of Michigan rightly saw the ills of this approach, and sought to rectify it. They voted to usher in the constitutional change that bans using race as a factor in college admissions. In other words, that all prospective students, regardless of race, would be considered on the basis of their merits and achievements alone, and not on a perceived need to fill some kind of racial void. A radical idea, indeed. Not surprisingly, this was quickly labeled as discriminatory, prompting a series of court cases that eventually culminated in Tuesday's Supreme Court decision, which allowed Michigan to do as it pleases with its constitution. Also not surprisingly, this decision prompted a 58-page dissent from Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in which she exclaimed that, emphasis added, the Constitution does not protect racial minorities from political defeat. But neither does it give the majority free rein to erect selective barriers against racial minorities. The court ought not sit back and wish away, rather than confront, the racial inequality that exists in our society. It is this view that works harm, by perpetuating the facile notion that what makes race matter is acknowledging the simple truth that race does matter. Doesn't this statement openly imply that minorities aren't smart enough to get into college without the aid of racial preferencing? After all, Michigan wants to admit college students based on academic merit and not race. So what else are we to infer? Indeed, this probably isn't the platform upon which Sotomayor and other dissenters are operating. They are, as Sotomayor made clear in the latter half of that statement, operating on the tired premise that the United States is still full of racists, the majority of whom are white, or African Americans like Justice Clarence Thomas, who apparently hate their own race. For people like Sotomayor, affirmative action, or racial preferencing, is the only way to rectify this. If Michigan's choosing to accept students on a completely colorblind basis isn't honorable in the eyes of Sonia Sotomayor, what is? What is the ultimate end in this struggle, if not to curtail all racial discrimination? AP photo/Paul Beatty. AP photo/Paul Beatty. The question in this debate is simple: is it acceptable to discriminate against a certain race because of the ills a former generation perpetrated? We can play this game both ways. If it is the right of every person to seek reparations from, and even discriminate against, those whose ethnicity once did them wrong, then I should be allowed to discriminate against Germans for the way the Nazis treated the Jews, for I am part Jewish. I should be allowed to discriminate against our government officials for the way their predecessors treated the Cherokee Indians, for I am part Cherokee. I should be allowed to discriminate against the English for the way that they massacred the Irish at Wexford and Drogheda, for I am part Irish. The list goes on in perpetuity. Where does it end? The fact is that it can't. Not down this path, at least. It ends when people, especially our leaders, stop making everything about race. Mary Ramirez is a full-time writer and creator of www.afuturefree.com-a political commentary blog. She can be reached at afuturefree@aol.com or on Twitter @afuturefree. Blaze contributor channel supports an open discourse on a range of views. The opinions expressed in this channel are solely those of each individual author.